Thank you very much, and it's great to have all of you here in Denver with us. We're actually located here in Denver, so it's great that I just had to take the train from my house to get here, and I thank all of you for traveling from the farthest parts of the country. I want to run through a little bit about the Education Commission of the States and our commitment to the Arts Education Partnership and our support of the work that all of you have been doing in your 10 states. And then I want to get into the nitty-gritty differences between policy and politics. The Education Commission of the States, we are an unbiased, bipartisan organization that really looks at state education policy across the board. From early learning to K-12 to post-secondary, from civics to arts to STEM, we cover the policy side of things and really view ourselves as one of the indispensable, essential members of any policy team. And when you think about what's happening in education in a lot of states, I think a lot of us think, oh my gosh, the whole state's involved. I'd argue there may only be 15 or 20 major players in most states who are actually have the levers to change education policy. And those 15 to 20 are the people that we work with and we serve directly on issues like Arts Education Partnership. At the Education Commission of the States, we believe strongly in the power of learning from experience. And we believe that it's important to figure out what's going on in other states, like you have been doing over the last 3 years, to understand the policies you might be able to consider. Far too often I get calls from legislators or governor's office saying, we want to do this. And what they haven't thought about is, are there other states that have already tried that? What did they do right? What did they do wrong? How do we learn from their policies so we don't have to recreate the wheel? I talk a lot about a House Education Chair and a Senate Education Chair who are no longer in office, but were just a few years ago. Almost 2/3 of our legislatures are citizen legislatures. That means that people are doing really, really hard work and putting in 80 hours a week, but being a legislator is not their full-time job. In this case, one of those chairs of education actually worked at the beginning of the life cycle. He was a farmer. And the other chair worked at the end of the life cycle. He was a mortician. These two people probably were the most influential education policymakers in that state. And figuring out how we can share with them the information in other states is really important, because when I met with them, they'd say, education's not my strong suit. I'm here to try to lead and make things better for the kids in our state. So how can you at Education Commission of the States help us define those policies? We work across the country with 350 different commissioners, and we're in statute in most states. So normally my commissioners are the governor, the chief state school officer, the chairs of the education committees, usually someone from higher ed and early learning. And so it's a really interesting representation of who we're hearing from. This is important to note because when I go into a state, I was in Oklahoma just last week, and I get my commissioners together for a breakfast or a coffee to talk about where we can help them. They all know each other. But I hear the same common theme, which is, I haven't seen you since the governor's holiday party last year. They're busy people, so post-secondary is not always thinking about K-12, and the governor's office may be engaged in natural disasters and other things and not working with the chairs of the education committees as well as they could. And so finding ways to connect these players is really important, and I think it gets to one of the parts that both Narek and Jeff talked about, which is how to engage those stakeholders, and not necessarily one by one, but collaboratively. A lot of the work that we do is around research, reports, convenings, and counseling. And so we do a lot of research for these policymakers. We do a significant amount of looking at all of the different bills on education policy and arts policy. We actually have small celebrations in our office when some states pass their State Appropriations Act. I know that sounds absurd, but our staff gets excited because we're policy wonks, we embrace that, and we actually read the first word in the bill to the last word in the bill, pull every single education policy out of that bill and put it in our database. Last year we had over 2,500 education policies we put in our database. So when a state calls us and says, we want to do something on arts education, we can say, great, let us check the database, because there's probably 7 or 8 states that have already started down this road, and it might be helpful for you to look at what they did before you try to recreate your own wheel. One of the things I want to talk to you about, though, is not just the policy, but the politics. And we don't take a side. I'm actually governed by a board that is very bipartisan. I have a Republican chair right now, a governor from Mississippi. I had the Democratic governor from Montana, who was my former chair. But the changes that we're seeing and who is in these elected positions is turning over at a rate quicker than we are used to. And this is really important for you to think about, especially based on the 5 goals around policy that Jeff just highlighted. So in 2016, there were actually 12 states that held governor's races. This was just almost a year ago, last November. 8 brand new governors were elected and started office in January of this year. That's a pretty big turnover rate. But then we look at going forward, there are 36 governor's races from today until just 12 months from now when the 2018 elections take place. And of those 36 governor's races, 16 of those governors are term limited. It doesn't matter if they want to run again, they can't. So New Jersey and Virginia have a race coming up here in about 4 days. We've got 34 governor's races that are going to take place in November of 2018. And this is a dramatic shift because when we look at where the governors are, we had 8 new ones in 2016. We have 3 that either resigned or went to the Trump administration. Governors of South Carolina and Iowa have been confirmed as members of President Trump's cabinet. Governor of Alabama resigned on his own accord, and you can Google that and figure out what was up and what may not have been. That being said, there were 3 governors that have left office already this year, not because of elections. We know there's going to be 16 governors who are term limited. We are guaranteed 27 new governors in America in a 24-month period. And there's a lot of other governors who are going to be running for election, but there's no guarantee that they will win. And in some of these states, while the governor has the ability to run for a 2nd or 3rd term, they've already announced they're not interested in that. In Idaho and in Minnesota, the governors who are there could run again and have said they won't. Why does this matter? Because if you look at your 10 states that are represented here, 9 of them are going to have an election that is coming up in the next 12 months. New Jersey in 4 days. So of those 9, 6 of your states will not have the governor you currently have in office 12 months from now. And so figuring out how you can build that stakeholder engagement to be ready for that change is really important. We're not just seeing this in the governor's office, though. We're seeing it in education policy writ large. There's a large amount of turnover in state legislatures, and especially if your state has term limits, the education chair of the education committee is not staying in that position for 8 or 10 years like they used to. Legislators in term-limited states are jumping onto the education committee to be chair, try to get to appropriations, try to get to minority or majority leader in some capacity, so they're moving quickly. And so it's really important to figure out how you build those relationships longer term. Who do you think might be running for chair of the education committee in 4 years? Who do you think will be moving into leadership in that capacity so that you can hopefully train them on the value of arts education while they're in the education committee? There are 3 of your states, Arizona, Arkansas, and Massachusetts, that won't be having an election, your governor could run for re-election, and North Carolina will not be having an election because they just had one last year. But this is really important when you think about the stakeholder engagement aspects of what you're doing with SP3. A lot of times when I've worked with organizations on policies like this, they think about how they can get their report finished. They think about how they can share it at one hearing or in one meeting with somebody from the governor's office, and they consider it completed. The changing nature of who's in these offices means you're going to have to prepare yourself to give the same message potentially 20 times in 1 year to 20 different people because they're going to be changing on who's in those roles. It's actually a great opportunity for you. It's a great opportunity for you to start thinking about the success that you've had, sharing the data from those successes with those incoming people, and getting down to what Narek talked about on stakeholder engagement and convenings. How many meetings can you have in your state or area where you can get those incoming new leaders to be a keynote speaker or to be an MC or to be engaged at your meeting? That is one of the best ways to get some of these elected officials to feel like they own a piece of what your success is, and probably to become an ambassador for what you're doing moving forward. I also want to highlight a little bit on ESSA and what we're seeing. I've got some great staff in our K-12 team, and they've read all 17 of the ESSA plans that have already been submitted. We're in the middle of reading all 34 of those that are being reviewed right now. And one of the things we continue to hear back from a lot of different communities is there's nothing about arts in the ESSA plans, or there's nothing about STEM in the ESSA plans, and there's some frustration there. I would urge you to not look at that necessarily as a negative. Many states that we've seen filled out their ESSA plan in some capacity with the goal of making sure that they can obtain federal funds, but they didn't want to put their entire plan of action in the ESSA plan and be held accountable by the federal government when the Every Student Succeeds Act is really set on giving states empowerment. So I would urge you to work with your chief state school officer and with many of the deputies in your state education agencies to not focus on what's not in or what is in your ESSA plan, but instead to look at what is the goal of that state education agency and what are the goals that they have longer term. The arts scan that we've done and we continue to do, which shows major areas on arts education policies, is a tool for you to use in comparison. Most elected officials look at 5 states, the 4 that geographically surround them, and the 1 state they aspire to be. So figure out how you can go into your state and compare where your neighboring states and the 1 state you think your chief or your governor aspires to be are on education policies in the arts, and it can help you to be some comparisons. The other is to look at a paper that we released, and we've gotten a lot of good traction, which is really called ESSA and What is a Well-Rounded Education. Our website's easy to get to at ecs.org, and it's a giant search engine. Just type in well-rounded in the search engine title there, and it'll pull up that paper. But that paper is really helpful, especially with the turnover in elected officials, to say, what does ESSA mean for you, and how does well-rounded play into this? How does arts, how does STEM, how does civics, how do extracurricular activities play into the education policies that you're going to be pushing? Lastly, I just want to highlight a little bit about the real value of sharing knowledge and figuring out how you can do some of these convenings. Americans for the Arts has been a tremendous partner with us, but finding ways in your state that you can get the right people in to do these kind of convenings. Whether it's seeing if Narek or Jeff, it's easy for me to offer them to travel, if Narek or Jeff can come into your state and help do a national presentation on what's happening so that then you can delve into some brainstorming session with some of your policymakers on what you're going to do, or whether it's working with Jane Best, who's our director of the Arts Education Partnership, or some of our team with the Arts Education Partnership to help. That's what we're here for, and that's really why we've been so supportive of this SP3 project that you've all invested your time in. There's a lot of successes out there, and the more you can find ways to share those successes, both individually and collectively across the policymakers in your state, I think the more we're going to have an opportunity to truly see education transform from an assessment based on English and science and math to really how are we providing our children with the best well-rounded education possible. So it's an honor to be here with all of you, and I know we're going to have some Q&A going back and forth, but welcome to Denver, and look forward to working with all of you today and into the future. Thank you.